is that you can just do it by numbers, hitting number targets. You can't just take them into the universities and just hit your quotas and then not do anything about it. It should be part of a very broad policy of affirmative education, not just affirmative action, but affirmative education. As I say, what they're doing in Oxford now is giving people who come from historically underprivileged backgrounds and giving them a foundation year, spending a whole year making sure that they get up to standards so they can compete with people who come from who've been through a more rigorous educational system. And I think one of the many problems with affirmative action in America is that they've tended to accept people and then just let them do what they do. And quite often that means either dropping out or moving to courses that are less convenient.
Or gerrymandering the standards themselves, or criticizing the standards themselves. Well, okay, so I'm going to press you on that a little bit.
Yeah.
You did point out just before we had this last bit of conversation that the danger in the elite institutions in the US in particular are the exceptions to the meritocratic principle, right? And so how do you reconcile the desire that you just expressed to, in certain cases, to redress historical wrongs with the problem of exception to the fundamental individualistic meritocratic rule? Because it's that's a typical conservative objection in some sense. It's like, yeah, that's your exception, but then so there's going to be 10 other people that have a slightly different case to make for exceptions, and then we're back to the same problem. So we should just stick to the damn harsh 11 that's an actual cutoff, right? Despite the fact that it causes a certain amount of trouble, because there isn't a better solution.
Sure, absolutely. As I say, I came to this position reluctantly because it's an inconsistent position, but I also think it's a pragmatic position. I think that the injustice involved with slavery was of such a different order that we need to make recompense for it. The society in general has to make recompense for it, and it continues to shape the opportunities of Black Americans. But I would not extend that principle, let's say, to recent immigrants who, by the very fact that they've immigrated to the United States, have massively improved their life chances. I'd like to keep it limited to essentially the descendants of slaves, and also I would like say that it's something that should be time limited. It's something that we want to get beyond. We want to get beyond it and to a world in which we can begin to judge people purely on the basis of as individuals. What that time frame would be, I'm not sure, but it needs to be something that's ended. And that's why I think there's a really important distinction between affirmative action and the talk now of diversity. Because diversity is based on a very different philosophy from affirmative action. The philosophy of affirmative action is we did something bad and we've got to make up for it. The philosophy of diversity...
Within the confines of a meritocratic system.
Yes, within the confines of a meritocratic system, we are actively searching for talent, and we have to actively search for talent in certain populations much more than we do in other populations because of their history. Now, the logic of diversity is very different from that, because the argument of diversity from the back case was that diversity is a good in itself, and you have to judge people as members of groups, because it's by mixing those members of groups, because different groups have different characteristics, that you produce better educational outcomes. Now that's
yes, there's no evidence for that. That's wrong, technically wrong. Well, it's partly wrong because, look, we could talk about one of the arguments you lay out in your book that certain psychologists, and they tend to be educational psychologists, have levied against strict meritocratic tests like those that are fundamentally IQ tests. So that would be the SAT, the GRE, everything that's used for entrance into undergraduate universities, where that's used in graduate school, professional schools. That's all IQ testing, essentially. And people will say it's not, but that's because they don't know what they're talking about. Okay, so then you might say, well, IQ is pretty singular, and it's a pretty good predictor of long-term success in a cognitively complex society. But there are other sources of variance, possibly. So you get thinkers like Robert Sternberg, for example, who talked about practical intelligence, and the multiple intelligence theorist Howard Gardner, and both of whose scientific work I think is shoddy beyond comprehension. and a terrible answer to a problem that's been answered actually quite nicely psychometrically. We know there are other sources of variability. There's variability of temperament, 5 dimensions. That's a lot, 5 dimensions. And I don't think that's a biased finding, and it was agnostic theoretically. It emerged out of pure brute force statistics. That's where the diversity lies, and there is not a lot of racial difference in temperament. So the idea that group membership produces diversity of a sort that would actually broaden the human scope of any discussion, any corporation, etc., is just wrong. There's no evidence for it whatsoever, and it's even worse than that because it makes the presumption that the essential source of diversity is in fact ethnicity and race, and that can go wrong very badly.
But the diversity argument is a much more profound threat to a meritocratic society than the affirmative action argument, because the diversity argument has no possible time limit, and it's fundamentally opposed to individualism. It's fundamentally illiberal because it says that group membership is fundamental to our identities, and that you must judge people, at least partly, if not primarily, on the basis of group identity. But I wanted to move to go back to your point about Foucault, which I think is a very interesting point, and I think one which is absolutely refuted by history. Because one of the arguments that the critics of meritocracy make is that meritocracy is basically propaganda for plutocrats, or it's propaganda for the ruling elite. The ruling elite chooses people according to its own criteria. It invents those criteria. They're essentially the criteria of the capitalist class or the ruling class, and only people who fit those criteria will be selected. So it's purely socially constructed.
Yeah, on the basis of the drive to power.
Of the drive to power. But I would say that actually something very different is going on, and that's why the history really matters here, is that meritocracy is a Promethean concept, or it's a mutable concept that actually has its own internal logic. So if you look at Britain as an example of this, in the middle of the 19th century, a group of educated bourgeois men, the intellectual aristocracy, decided that they wanted to take power from the landed elite. And they said that they would do, people like them, Thomas Macaulay, people with names like Huxley and Haldane and Keynes, and these people and Stephen wanted to have power, and so they said what they needed to do was to have open competition for jobs in the civil service, Oxbridge fellowships, and the rest, and open competition that was determined by your ability to perform in examinations. So that you could say, well, these are a bunch of people who are advancing their power. They invent these ideas to advance their power. But look at what happens historically. First of all, you get women coming along and saying, well, if my brother can get a fellowship of Trinity College, Cambridge by doing this exam, why can't I? And indeed, they say you've got to if open competition means anything, you can't just exclude women. If examinations test objective ability, you can't just say we'll only have them for half of humanity. So the very logic is self-perpetuating. So you do indeed get a bunch of very clever women who come along and knock on the door of these institutions. So I tell this story in my book of a woman called Philippa Fawcett, who in 1892 sits for the Cambridge mathematics tripos, which is the hardest examination in the world, and she comes top. She gets the best results. She beats everybody. But of course, at that point, women weren't actually officially allowed to sit these examinations. So she is classified as above the senior wrangler. The senior wrangler is number one, but she's classified as above the senior wrangler because she has taken on this system and beaten it. So then there's the working classes. You've got a whole bunch of people who come from poor backgrounds, but are born very bright, who are born with a great desire for knowledge. They come along and they knock on the door of the civil service, and they knock on the door of Oxford and Cambridge and say, judge us by these standards, and we'll get into these universities. And the same happens. You get somebody like W.E.B. Du Bois in the United States, a black person who becomes the first, I think, tenured professor at Harvard, wrote this magnificent book on the Philadelphia Negro, writes this great stuff on the talented tenth, of the population who are going to drive progress in all populations. So what you're doing is not creating a system whereby the ruling class can regulate who comes up and who doesn't, whereby the ruling class defines what merit is. You have a system which, by its own logic of open competition, of examinations, changes the nature of the ruling class. And I don't think any of the people who set up the system in the first place imagined universities in which 60% of the people going to them would be women. Imagined a system in which you have massive numbers of ethnic minority people or of working class people going to university. So merit is not a conspiracy of the plutocratic elite. Indeed, it's something which constantly reconfigures society with the outside group coming in and getting ahead as a result of the openness of competition.
Okay, so I want to hit hard at that argument because I've been trying to parse out in my own mind exactly what it was that Foucault was doing. And so one of the problems that has emerged since the 1960s is the problem of the realization of the complexity of perception. So up until about the 1960s, it was more or less assumed that the world was just made out of objects in some simple way, and that we saw those objects, and then we thought about them and evaluated them and acted. And that's just wrong. That isn't how it works at all. It's almost impossible to perceive a visual landscape. We have almost no idea how we do it. It looks like you need an intelligence that's embodied in some sense and that can act in order to perceive. So perception is extraordinarily tightly tied to action. And there's almost an infinite number of interpretations of any given visual landscape. And the same problem bedevils all other forms of perception. That emerged in AI and has bedeviled robotics engineers ever since, which is why we don't have robots zipping around doing everything that we could do. And then it also emerged in literary criticism. It's like, well, how many ways can a text be interpreted? Well, innumerable ways. Well, how do you know which of those ways is canonical? Oh, we don't know how we know that. Well, how do you know the whole canon is canonical then? Because it's just a meta text. Well, we don't know that. Well, how is it you understand a text, given its innumerable interpretations? We don't know that. We don't know how we do that. Well, maybe you just do it as part of your drive to power.
Yeah.
Okay, premature answer to a very difficult question. That's Foucault. He essentially assumes that the will to power is at the basis of categorization itself, and even at the basis of the process of categorization, which is even a deeper criticism, right? It's nothing but your drive to elevate yourself in power hierarchies that governs the process by which you categorize, and even your justifications for that categorization. Okay, I think that is the most cynical thing you can think, and I don't say that lightly. But it's not that easy to detail out what the alternative is. Now, you're pointing at it to some degree with this issue of merit that transcends the power drive of any particular group of people, even those who might be pushing the idea of merit. Well, there's something deep down in there. Is what is it that's being facilitated that isn't the drive to power? And we haven't got that conceptualized well. The university, especially the humanities departments, wouldn't have been so easily taken over by the postmodernist types who insist upon this kind of interpretation if the counter-argument was well articulated.
Well, one of the problems with Foucault, the many problems with Foucault, is I'm not sure how one would go about disproving his claims, because they're so all-encompassing and so sort of mutually self-reinforcing. I don't know how one would say your interpretation of text is not right.
Well, you did it with the historical examples, right?
Well,
your claim is.
I would hope to do that, but I would say that Foucault has a huge influence on the revolt against the meritocracy in the 1960s and 70s, because he's basically saying that the categories that we use to make distinctions between people are, as you say, are the products not of sense or organizational necessity or convenience or efficiency, but of power. I happen to believe that the arguments in favour of meritocracy can be made in terms both of social justice and in terms of economic efficiency. I think we can demonstrate that meritocratic institutions and meritocratic countries and systems are more economically productive, that they have a higher, a higher level of efficiency, that productivity rates are higher in such societies than in other societies. So just to dismiss it all as a mishmash of power plays, I think, it can be subject to.
Well, okay. So let's take that. Let's take that. Let's take that as a starting point then, because at least in principle, one of the things that the people who claim that those in power are doing by imposing their category system is subjecting those who are deprived to a level of absolute deprivation that's so terrible that it's unjust and immoral. But if the counterclaim is, no, you wait a minute, when we make arguments on the basis of individualistic meritocracy, and the net consequence of that is that although there's still fair degree of income disparity, that the bottom gets lifted up far enough so that absolute privation, let's say of the sort that defines starvation, just to take an example, no longer exists, that you interfere with that at your peril, even if you're on the left, and you actually care for the poor and dispossessed.
Absolutely, I believe that I can demonstrate quite clearly that meritocratic societies have higher levels of productivity. So if you take a family company, or if you take family companies in general as a category, and compare them with public companies that will appoint people primarily on merit, you will see that public companies are more productive, that they grow faster, that they're better at turning inputs into outputs than family companies. Family companies have a much bigger variance of performance, but the average performance of public companies. If you take countries that are pretty meritocratic, they will have a higher growth rate than countries that aren't meritocratic. So let's take Singapore, which is in many ways the most meritocratic country in the world. Its growth rate, which has been extraordinary, has been powered by its use of human capital, by its meritocracy. Compare Singapore with Sri Lanka, which in 1960 they were on comparable income levels. I think Sri Lanka was a bit richer. Singapore, by focusing relentlessly on meritocracy, has pulled ahead. Or take.
And do you think the data linking meritocracy per se and the stringent meritocracy in Singapore to that economic advancement?
I think that you can collect data on this. So another example would be if you take Sweden or any of the North European countries and compare them with Greece and Italy. Greece and Italy being nepotistic or familial in their organisation, and much more dominated by family companies and much more dominated by informal familial arrangements. They have got lower growth than Sweden, and also the rate of growth in Italy has been slowing down recently as they've moved towards as the effect of high technology has begun to kick in. So the growth rate in Italy, which was quite fast after the Second World War, as society as economies are becoming more advanced, is beginning to slow down because a familial nepotistic organisation just is proving to be incompatible with an IT based society. And there's plenty of economists, Luigi Zingales at the University of Chicago primarily, who've done work showing that meritocracy, using big data sets on how companies select people, on how open the educational system is, on how much corruption there is, that meritocratically organised societies have higher growth rates.
Well, there's a very, very well developed psychometric literature in management psychology, the actual science of management psychology. There is a bit of that, although most of management psychology is rubbish, and the same for most of leadership psychology. But there's good data looking at difference in individual productivity rates across a multi-year period after hiring, depending on the method of selection. And the best method is one that's G-loaded. The second best method is one that assesses conscientiousness, big five conscientiousness. The best test combination is a combination of those two, a weighted combination of those two. And it predicts individual productivity at about 0.6, which is staggeringly high by psychometric standards, by the standards of such things. And that data is very, very well developed by, I think, the best psychometricians and statisticians that are working in psychology. And, if you're a social scientist and you say, well, those things aren't believable, I would say, I defy you to find anything social scientists have ever demonstrated using any methods other than those methods that show results more than 1/3 is great. So if you throw out all that, you throw out everything. It's the same methods.
But so if we accept that economic growth is a good thing, and improvements in productivity are good things because they make the life of the average person better as well as the life of the of successful entrepreneurs better. I think the consequences of this, which as I said, which can be demonstrated, are extremely big, and this is what leads me to the biggest worry in my book, and that is that we live in a world that doesn't just consist of the West. We live in a world in which you're getting the biggest and most serious challenge to Western dominance that we've seen ever, which is coming from China. And that if we are seeing at the moment meritocracy being abandoned in various ways in the United States, at a time when I believe that China is becoming more like Singapore and taking meritocracy much more seriously, both in terms of its educational system, which is very, very competitive, in terms of its university system, which is both highly selective and growing all the time, and the way that the Communist Party operates, and I think it does set itself performance standards and even promotes people on the basis of examinations. If we have America becoming less meritocratic or less enthusiastic about meritocracy, and China becoming more meritocratic or at least more enthusiastic about meritocracy, that presents the possibility of a future in which China really pulls ahead of the United States. I think I accept there are lots of objections to this. China has massive levels of corruption, it has the red princes, it has enormous inefficiencies and internal inequalities and the rest of it. But imagine if I'm right, imagine if China really is slowly slouching towards being a Singapore, but with 1.4 billion people.
Yeah, not so slowly. Not
Yeah.
like historical
Yeah.
standards.
Yeah, over the
That
last
has massive
150
implications
years.
for the future. And what is America doing at the moment? You've got gifted programs being abandoned. You've got SATs being abandoned for university entrance. Boston Latin, which has used to
So
select people
true.
on the basis of examinations, is ceasing to do so and is now accepting people on the basis of lotteries. The same with Lowell High School in San Francisco. You've got these books like Michael Sandel and Markovitz's book attacking the principle of meritocracy at the same time that you've got this sort of rather plutocratic Ivy League system. So you're getting the ladder, and then you've got the attacks on the elite schools in New York. So you've got the ladder being pulled down on the one hand, and you've got a sort of woke plutocratic elites on the one hand enjoying the fruits of all this educational, these vast dowries that the education system has, but on the other hand, not really being willing to reach out, which is what a meritocracy should be about, to the most talented groups in the whole of society. I think that means ultimately that America loses and China wins, which is not something I want to see.
Well, I spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley, and it's a very interesting place to be. And what you see there is an unbelievable concentration of unbelievably smart people. And so that's a merit-based establishment, and look what it's produced. I mean, it's absolutely stunning. It's absolutely remarkable. It's singular in some sense. And that's all a consequence of because, I mean, you get meritocratic selection, and that's one thing, but then you get this multiplier effect when you get people who have passed through that system and they all get together. And you
Depends
see
on what
also
you
the
consider
tremendous
intelligent.
consequences of exactly that for India, for example, because the Indian Institute of Technology is incredibly selective, and it's producing graduates who are certainly the equal of MIT graduates, which is really saying something. And so many of their best and brightest went to Silicon Valley. And what's happened is they've dumped immense amounts of capital back into India and facilitated the development of a robust technological society there. And so it's been to everyone's stunning benefit, assuming, as you said, that economic growth and material prosperity are valuable. And you could critique that idea. You could say, well, we should be more ascetic. There are other values we should pursue than material prosperity. But I do not see that coming from the left. What I see happening is an insistence that the corrupt aspect of our current society is the lack of material prosperity at the bottom, and simultaneous interference with the only process we know of that has historically demonstrated its ability to redress that. So what's going on? Like, why has that happened on the left?
Well, why the left? I just pick up on your point about MIT. MIT is now going through a big process of producing a mission statement or a.
Oh God! Well, do you know that 75?
Excluded the word merit from it. They've excluded the word merit. That's MIT of all places.
Yeah, of all places, 75% of applicants to the UC system in the research science streams are rejected without consideration of their research history on the basis of their diversity statement, which is something introduced now in Canada. To get a grant at many of the federal agencies, you now have to produce a diversity statement or some equivalent of that along with your research proposal. Yeah, no
So I
kidding.
think something very. Go back again to the late 19th century in the United States. You had a ruling class that became very worried about itself. It was very worried about the level of inequality. Very worried about plutocracy. Very worried that it was becoming European and no longer sort of American. And what they did as a result of that was to construct a ladder of opportunity and throw that ladder down as deeply as possible. From Harvard down to the local village school. There's a sort of sense that we must draw all the talents from right across this great country. Now we have the similar phenomenon, which is the creation of a plutocratic elite, which is very divorced from the whole of society. But instead of saying, well, we must create a ladder, we must make sure that the ladder really works, and we must get talent from everywhere we possibly can. They're saying, well, what does talent mean? Does it really exist? Can you measure it? Is it really a good thing, or is it an instrument of ruling class power? It's sort of glass bead games being played, and very little that's being done that will really increase the supply of real talents, and some sources of talent, such as the Asian population, deliberately being ignored. And it's difficult not to conclude from that you actually have an old plutocratic elite that is, in these very convoluted ways, using woke language, basically engaged in opportunity hoarding. They don't want to be displaced from these positions. So,
Great, that's the net consequence of these sorts of actions. Well, at least in the short term. We'll see what happens as those ideas propagate, because they're deeply in, especially the Foucault insistence. It's the thing that I think disturbs me the most. The idea that at the basis of the active categorization itself is nothing more than a totalitarian will to power. That's a positively satanic vision, and it truly is. And what really frightens me about that is what it means for how you treat your enemies. Look, it's like you're just out for your power, that's it, and me too. There's no place we can meet as civilized people between our power hierarchies. That place doesn't even exist. And so what am I supposed to do with you if you oppose me? If we can't come to an accord? Well, you don't have to think very long before you come up with a solution for that.
well, that's why the history of meritocracy is so fascinating, because it moves in directions which were never designed. It was never designed to do in the first place. Once you set up the principle of open competition, the groups that succeed, that are coming up from submerged positions in society, are succeeding without any sort of plan, and quite often against the will of the traditional ruling elites. Against the land in the ruling elite is completely displaced by this process. So, and it comes because the system of testing, examination, open competition has its own internal logic, which is totally different from what Foucault would say, because all categories and all ideas must be instruments of the powerful.
Yeah, all categories, no matter what they are, right? It's an unbelievably deep criticism, and I think it was a reflection of Foucault's character itself, frankly speaking. He's not someone I admire at all on the ethical front.
No, I think that's right. But here we have subaltern groups. W.E.B. Du Bois is a particularly interesting example when he talks about the talented 10. These are subaltern groups who are saying, well, this system provides opportunities which we must seize, and which we can use to transform society peacefully and by rising up intellectually. And again, that's true of the women's movement. It's true of the working classes. You know, the aristocracy of labour.
It has something to do as well with our struggle and movement as a society towards the integration of something like ethics across multiple levels of analysis. So, so we say, well, we want we want our workforce to do something productive that elevates our material well-being and stops suffering. And so we want to make the micro movements that we make and the selections that we engender systemically serve that end. So the whole thing is integrated, and that desire for that integration for the greater common good in some sense, especially to elevate to alleviate the grossest elements of suffering at the most extreme end. That's an ethic and a desire that isn't captured properly at all. It's antithetical to the spirit of totalitarian oppression that Foucault insists, right, infects every act of categorization.
But meritocracy is also essentially a form of liberal individualism. It says that individuals should be judged on the basis of their own efforts and abilities. And it's also an idea that presents agency. It has agency at the very heart. It says that people can shape their own futures. They can shape their characters. They can work hard. They can get ahead on the basis of work and ability. That was always something,
and that they're properly rewarded for that.
And that they need incentives, but to do. And that's something that Foucault is obviously against, but a great bulk of modern sociology has been against that. It's removed the agency and a sense of agency. But I think that it exists. I think that there is a sense of agency. We do shape our destinies. We can work hard, or we can sleep all day, and we can exercise our talents, or we can choose not to exercise our talents, or
yes, and we have virtues.
Using that, we have virtues,
and we can exercise those, and we're not fundamentally totalitarian demons driven by nothing but the will to power.
Exactly. So I think that the philosophy embodied in liberal individualism is something that really needs to be defended. And again, it doesn't have enough defenders at the moment. And as you see, that large chunks of academia in particular have gone to postmodernism, which is ultimately dehumanizing, or it takes the agency out of being human, which is what being human, I think, is about. So I think meritocracy is right at the very center of a liberal view of the world.
Well, let's say amen to that and close this discussion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I very much appreciated and enjoyed talking to you. And
great.
It went very quickly.
Okay. Well, I hope we'll talk again sometime in the future.
I hope so too. We know that what we want is going to happen. We hate that. We hate that, and no wonder. So, and there are varying degrees of that, obviously. You can really be where you don't know what's going to happen, or you can only be there to some degree. But by and large, we're conservative creatures. Even if we're liberal in temperament, we can't tolerate that much uncertainty. And you might ask, well, why? And the answer is, well, because you can be hurt, pain, you can be damaged, you can become intolerably anxious, and you can die. So it's no wonder you're sensitive. We're very sensitive to negative emotion. And so our identities, functional identity regulates your emotion.
Why Beyond Order? What is the genesis of that title? How did you arrive at that title?
As far as I can tell, in the world of value.
Hey, get out of here.
So let's think about value for a minute. If you move towards something, you value it. Otherwise, you wouldn't move towards it. There's an old joke about the chicken. Is why did the chicken cross the road? And the answer to that is, well, he thought the other side was better. Well, that's the case, And we need a gradient of value to organize our action. And you have to prioritize, because you can't do everything at once. And so you do the thing that's most important right now. And that means you're in a world of importance. And that's a value. That's a value world. And the value world, as far as I can tell, has two broad components. The Taoists talked about it as yin and yang, and broadly speaking, it's order and chaos. And order tends to be represented with masculine symbols, and chaos tends to be represented with feminine symbols. That doesn't mean order is male and chaos is female. And, you know, I've been pilloried for this, even though it's hardly my proposition. But the idea of the patriarchy is a symbolic, it's a use of masculine symbolism to represent order. So, anyways, order is where what happens, order is, you're in order when what you want to happen happens when you act. And so that's reassuring, because not only do you get what you want, but the fact that you get what you want indicates that your theory about how to get what you want is true. And every time you fail, you don't get what you want, but you also undermine the validity of the theory that you're using to organize your perceptions and your actions. That's partly why people don't like to fail, because you don't know how far back that can echo, how far down your hierarchy of presuppositions that can echo. If you're clinically depressed, every minor failure means you're a worthless human being. And you never know when a failure is going to demonstrate that. You know, it can. In any case, there's chaos and order. They're the two great domains. And you have to contend with chaos, because too much of it overwhelms you. You drown in it. It's the flood. And that happens when your life gets beyond you. And you're somewhere where no matter what you do, nothing you want happens. It's a domain of terror and pain. Now, it's also a domain of unlimited possibility, because outside of what you know is everything you don't know. And there's untold riches to be gathered from the domain of everything you don't know. But that doesn't mean it still needs to be managed. It's dangerous. Now, the domain of order is the same way. It's like, if order becomes too extreme, then everything becomes cramped. It becomes totalitarian, and then that starts to pathologize. That's the dying king. The king who's dying for lack of the water of life is the old tyrant who can no longer see beyond his own presuppositions. And so my first book concentrated more on pathologies of chaos, and the second book more on pathologies of order. And they're a matched set in that regard, insofar as I was successful at doing that. And you know, the liberal types, they're very sensitive to pathologies of order. And the conservative types are very sensitive to pathologies of chaos. But they're both right. It's just, there's no final solution to that problem. You're stuck with it. It's an existential, it's an eternal existential concern. That's why mythological language is standard across people. Is no matter who you are, no matter when you live, you always have to deal with the fact that some things escape your competence. And no matter where you are, no matter who you are, you have to adapt to the fact of the existence of a value structure that's shared across a social group. It's the fundamental, so those are fundamental constituent elements of human experience. And we have symbols for them. And we all understand the symbols. So, for example, in Pinocchio, I'm not going to go into this because it's too complicated, but no one balks at a puppet going to the bottom of the ocean and being swallowed by a whale. Why? It makes no sense. There's nothing about that makes sense. Right? It's obviously not a... way more trouble than accumulated carbon dioxide. Not because accumulated carbon dioxide isn't somewhat of a threat, but when it becomes a global planetary threat that's a crisis, then it's a justification for virtually any political action.
Hello and welcome to Off Script. My name is Stephen Edgington, And today I'm joined by Dr. Jordan Peterson, the internationally acclaimed clinical psychologist and best-selling author. We're going
They were extremely popular with students. I mean, the reason that my Maps of Meaning course was turned into a 13-part series by this small Ontario television station, TV Ontario, was because the typical student comment on the post-course evaluations was, and I'm not making this up, this was 95% of the student comments over a 20-year period were the same. All the students said, this course changed the way I looked at absolutely everything. And so that was lurking in the background, and that's definitely part of what's driving this continued notoriety, let's say, or fame, popularity. I'm not sure how to characterize it.
It's not just the political though, is it? It's also a personal thing for many people, and you've helped with your book and through your lectures millions of people around the world. I'm sure you've seen letters and things like that from, the most amazing, most inspirational story, right?
Well, it's only political, I would say, in some sense, because what constitutes the political has become far too broad a category in our society. And so I'm speaking to individuals. When I started working on my first book on Maps of Meaning, I was trying to solve a problem. And the problem was, it was the problem of the Auschwitz guard, I suppose. How could you be like that? And the problem I was addressing was, how could I be like that? And then understanding that, let's say, then what could be done about it so it was less likely to occur? And my conclusion from that was, well, it was a conclusion that was mostly psychological and aimed at the individuals. Right? It's necessary for us to recognize our capacity for evil, to deeply recognize that, and to become better people. We're too powerful to not be better. That's political in some sense in our climate, because the discussion about the proper level of analysis for political conversation, for public conversation, has become political. Should it be the group? Should it be the individual? Well, I think, as far as I'm concerned about the individual, and for people who are politicizing based on group identity, that's a political statement. But I don't think it is, because the political isn't everything, so I don't think it's a political statement. It's deeper than a political statement. And look, you asked me a question. You asked me why I'm so well known, I suppose, or popular. I don't know what word to use. Why do you think it is? I mean, you wanted to interview me. What the hell do you think's going on?
Well, listen, I've got I don't like to use kind of personal experience in an argument, but I think it's interesting. I've read your books, and I found you so interesting as a sort of young white man, that sort of cliche thing. And I think that you just speak to so many people these days who feel nihilistic, who, as I said earlier, don't have meaning or don't feel that they have purpose in their lives. And you must know that you have spoken to millions of people and changed many, many people's lives. And I do want to talk about this phenomenon, and you are a phenomenon, if I may say, because I want to ask whether you feel that there's a danger in that there's a danger that people listen to you.
Yes, there's a terrible danger. Terrible danger.
Well, absolutely, because the point is...
all sorts of terrible danger.
Let me describe one of them.
Sure.
People may listen to you. These are young people forming their opinions about the world. They may listen to you uncritically, and they may view you as a sort of idol. So do you worry that there may become a sort of Jordan Peterson cult, as it were?
I can't say that I've had that as a specific worry, because I would have to really participate in that for it to really happen, and I don't want that to happen, and I know why I don't want it to happen, and I've known for a long time. I read this paper by Carl Jung years ago called The Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious, and he talked about exactly this phenomenon, and he wrote extremely lucidly and carefully about the danger of over-identifying with, let's say, religious ideas. So people come and listen to the lecture, and so then the question is, well, who are they listening to? Well, in some sense, they're listening to me, because there I am. But in some sense, they're not. I'm the embodiment of a set of ideas, just as we all are. We're all embodiments of sets of ideas, and those ideas aren't mine. They're the collective ideas of the human race in some sense, and to the degree that I can articulate them properly for this time and place, to the degree that I can be wise in my generation, a biblical phrase, a very astute biblical phrase, then I can communicate those ideas to myself and to other people, but I don't want to be mistaken for their source. I'm not their source, and I'm very aware of that, and I do what I can to make that clear to myself, and my family helps me out with that a lot. They understand the danger as well, and I mean, there's danger to me in this as well. I mean, I think I've been very ill for quite a long time, and it's not obvious why, but I think one of the sources was that I just was overwhelmed by insight into misery. I saw so many people that were so, well, grateful is part of it to me in the manner that I just described. But it's very affecting when that happens. It's not trivial. It's not a trivial experience, especially when it happens thousands of times. And I'm a reasonably astute observer of people because I have so much practice as a clinical psychologist. I can see what's going on with people pretty quickly if I really watch, and that is my proclivity to watch. That's why I've been able to maneuver reasonably well in these interviews where people have tried to skewer me. So if you're up to something, I can switch into clinical mode and watch you, and I can usually figure out what you're up to. And in any case, when people approach me, so I can see reasonably deeply into them and